If you have been following the mainstream financial press, you have been sold a very specific, very curated story about Venezuela. You've seen the headlines about restoring democracy. You've seen the State Department press releases talking about fair elections and human rights violations. You've seen the staged outrage when negotiations break down, and the quiet applause when Chevron gets a license renewed. They want you to believe that the United States' involvement in Venezuela, the sanctions, the blockades, the frozen assets, is a moral crusade against authoritarianism. They want you to believe this is a battle between liberty and tyranny. Turn off the news, ignore the press secretary. That narrative is a cage, and you are currently sitting inside it. This has absolutely nothing to do with who sits in the presidential palace in Caracas. It has nothing to do with ballot boxes, free speech, or the suffering of the Venezuelan people, which, while tragic, is a geopolitical irrelevance to the people pulling the levers in Washington. If the United States cared about authoritarianism, we wouldn't be selling weapon systems to half the monarchies in the Persian Gulf. No. What we are witnessing in Venezuela is not a diplomatic struggle. It is a desperate, logistical scramble to save the American energy grid from a structural collapse that almost nobody is talking about. The blockade isn't about punishment. It's about leverage in a resource war that the United States is currently losing. The reality is buried in the shipping manifests of the Gulf Coast refineries. It's hidden in the viscosity charts of global crude oil supplies. The United States is drowning in oil, yet it is starving for energy. We are the largest oil producer in the world, yet our strategic architecture is crumbling because we have the wrong kind of oil. This is the story of how a specific type of sludge found in the Orinoco Belt became the most dangerous substance on Earth. This is the story of how the sanctions backfired, how the dark fleet took over the oceans, and why your cost of living is tied directly to a heavy, toxic crude oil that Washington pretends it doesn't need. Welcome to the real war. It's not about ideology, it's about viscosity. To understand why Venezuela is the fulcrum of modern energy geopolitics, we have to look at the numbers that the headlines ignore. Let's strip away the politics and look at the balance sheet. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not the United States. Venezuela sits on approximately 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. To put that in perspective, that is more oil than the United States, Canada, and Mexico combined. Geologically speaking, Venezuela is not a country. It is a gas station masquerading as a nation-state. But for decades, the relationship between Washington and Caracas was symbiotic. It was a marriage of convenience. Throughout the 20th century, Venezuela was essentially a remote province of the American energy sector. Their oil infrastructure, PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, SA, was built by Americans for Americans using American technology. The supply chains were integrated. The oil flowed north, the dollars flowed south, and the machinery kept humming. Then came the divergence. When Hugo Chavez took power, and subsequently under Nicolas Maduro, the narrative shifted. But the real break wasn't just rhetorical, it was financial. Venezuela began leveraging its massive reserves to take on debt, colossal amounts of debt, from China and Russia. By 2018, Venezuela owed China roughly $60 billion globally, much of it payable in oil. This is the crucial data point. The oil in the ground was no longer a sovereign asset of Venezuela. It was collateral for Beijing. When the U.S. imposed maximum pressure sanctions in 2019, the stated goal was to starve the Maduro regime of cash. We froze $7 billion in assets. We made it illegal for U.S. entities to buy Venezuelan crude. The logic was linear. Cut the revenue, collapse the regime. But here is the historical context that the State Department strategists missed or chose to ignore. The global energy market is not a closed loop controlled by the U.S. Treasury anymore. By cutting off Venezuela, we didn't just isolate a rogue state, we created a vacuum. And in geopolitics, vacuums are filled by your rivals. Historically, the U.S. relied on Venezuela for about 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day of imports. This wasn't just any oil, we will get to that in a moment, but a critical baseline for our energy security. When we turned off that tap, we assumed Venezuela would capitulate. Instead, they liquidated their sovereignty. They handed the keys to the fields over to Russian engineers and Chinese logistics firms. We forced PDVSA into a shadowy corner of the global market. We pushed them away from the transparent, dollar-denominated Western banking system and into the opaque, off-ledger world of the Euro-Asian bloc. Look at the trade volumes from 2020 to 2023. While U.S. imports dropped to zero, exports from Venezuela to undisclosed destinations, a euphemism for China via Malaysia, skyrocketed. We didn't stop the oil from flowing. We just lost control of where it went. Furthermore, consider the condition of the infrastructure. Venezuelan output collapsed from 3 million barrels a day in the 90s to roughly 700,000 barrels today. The mainstream media blames socialism. While mismanagement is a huge factor, the deeper reality is that U.S. sanctions prevented the maintenance of the upgraders. Massive facilities needed to process their heavy oil. We broke the machinery. Now, why does this matter to you? Because while we were breaking their machinery, we forgot that our machinery was designed to run on their product. We severed a limb to spite the body. The context here is not just about a failed coup or a socialist dictator. It is about the United States voluntarily surrendering its influence over the largest oil reserve in the world, handing it on a silver platter to Beijing and Moscow, all while our own strategic reserves were being drained to historic lows to combat inflation. The blockade was supposed to be a siege weapon. Instead, it became a wall that locked us out of the warehouse. Now we need to get technical. To understand this conflict, you have to understand that oil is not a single commodity. It is not a uniform black liquid. Thinking all oil is the same is like thinking a ribeye steak and a handful of gravel are the same because they both have mass. In the energy industry, we classify oil primarily by two metrics: density, measured in API gravity, and sulfur content, sweet versus sour. The United States, thanks to the shale revolution in the Permian Basin, is the world's largest producer of light sweet crude. This is the champagne of oil. It's thin, it flows easily, and it has low sulfur. It's great for making gasoline. We are drowning in this stuff. We have so much of it, we export it. Venezuela, on the other hand, produces extra heavy sour crude. This is the sludge. It has the consistency of peanut butter or molasses. It is loaded with sulfur and heavy metals. To get it out of the ground, you often have to inject steam or dilute it just to make it flow. Here is the mechanical problem that no politician will explain to you. The United States Gulf Coast refinery complex, the largest refining hub in the world, is not designed to process the light sweet crude we produce in Texas. This sounds insane, but it's a legacy of history. Decades ago, we thought the U.S. was running out of oil. We assumed we would be dependent on foreign imports forever. So we spent billions of dollars building massive, complex refineries specifically engineered to crack heavy, sour, dirty oil. These refineries act like giant pressure cookers, breaking down the long hydrocarbon chains of heavy sludge into high-value products like diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil. You cannot just feed light shale oil into a heavy oil refinery. It's like trying to run a diesel engine on jet fuel. It doesn't work efficiently. You run the equipment at suboptimal levels, you lose money, and crucially, you fail to produce the heavier distillates, specifically diesel. This is the mismatch. The U.S. produces light oil, but our refineries crave heavy oil. Before the sanctions, Venezuela was the perfect partner. They sent us the heavy sludge, we refined it into diesel and gasoline, and we sent them back the light diluents they needed to get more sludge out of the ground. It was a perfect chemical loop. When the blockade hit, we cut off the supply of heavy crude to our own refineries. We forced companies like Valero and Chevron to scramble. They had to look elsewhere. But where? Canada, their pipelines are full. Mexico, their production is declining. Russia, sanctioned. The Middle East, they keep their heavy oil for their own refineries now. This created a structural inefficiency in the U.S. energy system. We are forcing our refineries to run on a blend of oils they weren't optimized for. This reduces the crack spread, the profit margin for refiners, and it limits the yield of diesel fuel. And this is where the mechanics hit the economy. Diesel is the blood of the global economy. It powers the trucks that deliver your Amazon packages, the tractors that harvest your food, and the trains that move coal and raw materials. When you disrupt the heavy oil supply, you disrupt diesel production. When diesel gets expensive, everything you buy gets expensive. The sanctions on Venezuela broke the chemical supply chain of the Gulf Coast. We created a bottleneck in our own backyard. While the politicians were giving speeches about freedom, the refinery engineers were panicking about feedstocks. The mechanism of the blockade didn't just hurt PDVSA, it introduced a friction into the U.S. economy that manifests as persistent, sticky inflation. We are trying to run a heavy oil economy on a light oil diet, and the engine is knocking. That is the mechanics of the crisis. It's not politics, it's chemistry. Here is the irony. Here is the twist that proves that the people running our foreign policy are playing checkers while the rest of the world is playing 4D chess. The intended result of the blockade was to isolate Venezuela, starve the regime of revenue, and cause a collapse that would install a pro-Western government. The actual result? We incentivized the creation of a parallel, sanction-proof global oil market that the United States cannot control, cannot monitor, and cannot tax. When we kicked Venezuela out of the SWIFT banking system and banned the insurance of their tankers, they didn't stop selling oil. They just went dark. This gave rise to the ghost fleet, or the shadow fleet. These are hundreds of aging tankers, bought by shell companies in Dubai or Hong Kong, operating with their transponders turned off. They paint over the names of the ships. They do ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean to mix the oil and disguise its origin. This oil flows primarily to China and India, and because it is illegal oil, Venezuela has to sell it at a massive discount, sometimes $30 or $40 below the market price. Think about what that means. We are effectively subsidizing the energy costs of our biggest geopolitical rival. China gets Venezuelan heavy crude at a bargain basement price. They refine it in their own massive refineries, which, by the way, they built specifically to handle this type of crude. They use that cheap energy to power their manufacturing base. So, American sanctions make energy more expensive for American manufacturers because of the diesel issues we discussed, while simultaneously making energy cheaper for Chinese manufacturers. We are literally paying for our own economic containment. It gets worse. Because Venezuela could no longer rely on Western service companies like Halliburton or Schlumberger to fix their rigs, they invited in the Iranians. Iran, another sanctioned pariah, has become a key player in the Caribbean. They are sending technicians, condensate, and equipment to Venezuela. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. By trying to blockade Venezuela, we invited Iran and Russia to set up a base of operations in our hemisphere. We solidified an anti-American alliance right on our doorstep. We pushed these nations together into a survival pact. And look at the financial blowback. The weaponization of the dollar, using it to punish nations, has accelerated the global move toward de-dollarization. Venezuela, Russia, China, and Iran are now settling trades in yuan, rubles, or through barter. Every barrel of oil traded outside the dollar weakens the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. The twist is that the blockade saved Maduro. If Venezuela had remained integrated in the West, the economic crash might have been managed through the IMF, which comes with political strings. By forcing them into the black market, we made the regime dependent on illicit networks that are immune to public pressure. The elites in Caracas got richer off the black market arbitrage, while the average Venezuelan starved. We didn't kill the regime. We hardened it. We turned a disorganized, failing state into a fortress supported by our enemies. And now, as global oil supplies tighten, the U.S. is quietly, desperately trying to walk the sanctions back. You see the licenses being granted to Chevron? That's not diplomacy. That is capitulation. That is the U.S. admitting that the strategy failed and that we need the oil more than we need the moral high ground. Let's bring this home. Why should you, sitting in your living room in Ohio or Manchester or Munich, care about the viscosity of crude oil in the Orinoco Belt? because you pay for this foreign policy failure every single day. When you go to the grocery store and see that eggs are up 30%, or that a loaf of bread costs what a steak used to cost, you are told it's supply chain issues or corporate greed. Those are convenient scapegoats. The reality is that everything you buy has a transportation premium baked into the price, and that premium is dictated by the price of diesel. As we established, the U.S. blockade on Venezuelan heavy crude-starved U.S. refineries of the feedstock they need to efficiently produce diesel. When the supply of diesel tightens, the price spikes. When diesel spikes, the cost of trucking spikes. If a trucking company has to pay 40% more for fuel, they don't absorb that cost. They pass it to the retailer passes it to you. That inflation you are feeling, a significant chunk of it is energy policy blowback. But it goes deeper than groceries. It's about your savings. It's about the stability of the currency you work for. By weaponizing the financial system to enforce this blockade, the U.S. has signaled to the global South that their assets are not safe in dollars. If you are Brazil or Saudi Arabia or South Africa and you see that the U.S. can seize Venezuelan or Russian assets at will, you stop buying U.S. Treasury bonds. You start diversifying into gold. We are seeing a structural shift in global finance. If the demand for the U.S. dollar drops because oil is being traded in yuan, the value of the dollar eventually drops. That imports inflation. That destroys the purchasing power of your retirement account. We are entering a period of resource scarcity. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, the emergency buffer of oil kept in salt caverns in Louisiana, has been drained to its lowest levels in 40 years to keep gas prices down before elections. We don't have a safety net anymore. If a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, or if a war breaks out in the Middle East that closes the Strait of Hormuz, we do not have the heavy oil reserves to cushion the blow. The blockade on Venezuela removed our nearest, fastest backup option. You are living on the edge of an energy cliff. The blockade didn't make the world safer. It made your personal economy more volatile. We traded your financial security for a geopolitical bluff that failed. You are the collateral damage. We are witnessing the end of an era. The age of unipolar American dominance, where Washington could dictate the economic fate of a nation by simply flipping a switch at the Treasury Department, is over. The Venezuelan blockade is the tombstone of that era. It demonstrated the limits of financial warfare. It showed that if you push the world's resource-rich nations too hard, they will simply build a new economy without you. Capital is like water. Block it in one place, and it finds a new channel. We blocked the front door, so they built a new house. In the next 6 to 12 months, watch the BRICS alliance. Watch Saudi Arabia. Watch the flow of gold. The world is reorganizing into two distinct blocks. The financial bloc, the G7 relying on debt and currency manipulation, and the resource bloc, the global South controlling the oil, the gas, the minerals, and the food. Venezuela is the prize in the resource bloc. The U.S. knows it made a mistake. That is why you are seeing the silent retreat. That is why the sanctions are leaking. But it might be too late. The trust is gone. The infrastructure is realigned toward the east. The lesson here is brutal but simple. You cannot print energy. You cannot sanction physics. As we move forward, the countries with the stuff, the oil, the lithium, the copper, will dictate terms to the countries with the paper. The blockade was an attempt to assert the dominance of paper over stuff. It failed. Prepare yourself for a world where the dollar is just one currency among many, and where the price of your existence is determined by powers that no longer fear the United States. The spectacle is over. The bill is coming due, and it will be paid in heavy, sour crude.